Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Condo Solutions. Monday mornings, we talk about things that affect you in the condo and HOA world, some of the things that you may be familiar with but not fully understand, or some of the things you just may not be familiar with because you might be new to condos and homeowners associations in Florida. My name is Mark Breckbill. I'm a local CPA and a licensed community association manager and have been practicing in this area for 20 or 25 years, somewhere in that range. Along with me is Peter Mullengarden. Peter is our attorney who also has been practicing in this area pretty much all of his adult life and specializes in the area of condos and HOAs. So he's here to answer and handle all those legal questions and been doing this for about 16, 17 years now. So it is a program for you. We're out here to answer your questions. So it works best if you call us. 220-9788. 220-WSTU is the number in the studio. And we can get you on, get your question answered. A couple things to mention. When you do call in, you need to give us a name. We don't care what name, but we just don't like to call you hey you. So if you can give us a name, we appreciate that. We prefer you don't give us your association because your question may be the same or very similar to another association. And sometimes when people don't hear their association's name or hear some other association, they assume the answer doesn't necessarily apply, and many times it will. And then the other thing about that is that we're going to try to answer your question the best we can, but we don't have your documents. So we're going to give you what we call a radio answer, which means that it's the best we can do without your documents. But it is also for that very reason, when you call, we may talk a little broader about your problem than your specific facts, in case somebody has a similar but not exactly the same situation. So bear with us if we go astray, so to speak, to cover some of those, because we're trying to hopefully answer somebody else's question that may be too shy to call or may be reluctant to call. So anyway, that's the only ground rules. It's pretty simple. Other than that, if you do need to get a hard and fast, going to go to court type answer, then you need to give Peter or somebody like him a call that's got significant experience in the industry, and they can help you out and look at your documents and all that kind of stuff. So, good morning, Peter. How are you?
Good morning, Mark. I'm well. Thank you.
Good.
How are you?
Good. So we're ready to go this morning. Got our first caller, so we're going to go right to it. But appreciate you being on the line, and we'll get going this morning. Good morning, Tim.
Hi there. This is Jim, and I'm calling you
Jim,
from up north.
Yeah, Jim. How you doing?
Well, been better, but I'm here. How's the connection? Can you hear me all right?
Yep. You're good.
Yep, we can hear you.
All right. Well, I'm on a wireless phone, and if it goes dead, which it has happened up here, that's the reason I haven't just hung up on you. The reason I'm calling, I'm up here in Maine, and I have been looking over the information that's being made available about the session laws affecting condominiums. And you've probably had many discussions that I haven't been able to hear in recent days about this, but that's why I'm calling. And I'm going to ask a specific question, but then invite you folks to broaden the discussion to the new laws that affect condominiums in general. My specific question is, our attorney has sent out a notice that says, or a letter that says, describing these changes, that meetings other than annual meetings, written notice of a meeting other than an annual meeting, must include an agenda, be mailed, hand-delivered, or electronically transmitted to each unit owner and be posted in a conspicuous place on a condominium property or association property within the time frame specified in the bylaws. Now, all of that is very familiar to me, except it seems to be saying, and we have we follow the 78-hour state rule as far as posting notices, with an additional 24-hour notice requirement to the board members. This seems to say we now have to mail or electronically send out notices of the monthly meetings and any special meetings we might have.
Well, he's talking about membership meetings. The board meeting notices can still just be posted, depending on what you're doing. He's referring to a membership meeting as opposed to a board meeting.
Yeah, so that would only be, that would only be a meeting, periodically, where you're going to call a meeting of the full membership, not interim board meetings and that type of thing. Wouldn't impact those types of meetings.
There's only a few
Okay.
board meetings. There's only a few board meetings where you have to mail or electronically transmit the notice to the owner in addition to posting. And that's when you're adopting non-emergency special assessments, or you're adopting the budget, or you're adopting electronic voting. Those are the three that come to mind.
All right, so I'm reading this letter perhaps wrongly, because it says a meeting. And but anyway, you've answered that question, and it's a good answer. It means that the status quo as far as board meetings and even executive session meetings for the two allowed reasons can be posted under the 78-hour rule. So there's no change there then.
Yeah, 48-hour rule. Yes. Unless your documents go longer.
Right.
Oh, okay.
We add extra time. So for us, it's 78.
Okay, that's fine. I understand.
But
no, that's fine. I understand.
Okay, well, that's the specific question I had. The rest of these are listed here. They're of interest, and I guess I would invite you to opine on any that are serious changes to the condominium operations.
Well, I mean, there have been a lot of changes. I don't know if Mark and I are going to talk about that today or not. We can some. But there have been significant changes this year.
One other thing that I noticed that was again, I'm reading from our attorney's letter, so I may be misreading this incorrectly, but it seems that the legislature has gone after the fact and expanded the emergency powers as they affect condominiums greatly, basically to legitimize what we all had to struggle through during COVID in terms of how to conduct meetings and disaster plans and stuff like that, the advice of the local officials. It's quite interesting the way it's summarized in this letter.
And actually, I mean, you are reading that correctly. The emergency powers were modified fairly significantly to take into account an emergency like we just went through, or still going through in some respect, although the declaration of emergency is now over and has not been extended by the governor. But yes, the emergency powers, which back when this all began, and many of us, or most of us, who work with associations, were trying to put the square peg into the round hole, literally, because the emergency powers were really set up for more of a physical emergency, like a hurricane, right?
Yeah.
Or something like that, or a tornado. And they really weren't expressly addressed to this type of pandemic, virus, contagion, however you want to describe it, which wasn't physical with respect to the property, as we all know, but obviously had big impacts on the people's lives and health. So you're right, they did basically amend the emergency powers to take into account not only the physical type of emergency, the hurricane, but this other type of emergency where the association has to deal with meetings where people aren't there in person, having to deal with disinfecting and cleaning the property, the things that we've been dealing with. So you are correct that was a significant change, and also the fact that you could take actions based on what local public health officials were saying. So all that's true.
Yeah, well, I can remember, and it's interesting to be just having this discussion, but I can remember almost 2 years ago talking to you folks about how to best protect ourselves as we adopted different restrictions for our association. And between your advice and our attorney's advice, we tried to make ourselves bulletproof because back then we were fearful everybody was going to sue if we had a COVID death in our community. So we wanted to do everything to show that we were trying to prevent that. And we did. I think the association board then did an excellent job in building up that firewall against lawsuits. Now that the emergency order has expired and we're back to somewhat of a normal life, the current board has voted to remove those restrictions because they were becoming confusing with so many people now following the general rules. So this is one time that I have to think the legislature did something helpful. And adding this new section about legitimizing what we've learned.
Yeah. No.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I know people, here in my firm that were very involved in drafting this new language. And yeah, I mean, look, the law is in many times reactive, right? And not proactive. So, I mean, so we saw the reaction of the law to the COVID pandemic and trying to anticipate future, whether there are pandemics or other emergencies of a similar nature. And you're going to see the same thing, not that I'm shifting gears, but it is just germane to this. You're going to see the same thing now in the aftermath of the Champlain Towers South tragedy. Okay.
Yeah.
You're going to see the law again shift. Some people may say too late, but that's neither here nor there. Not here nor there. I'm just saying that's, we can argue all day long about that, but you're going to see the law change again reactively to increased inspections, maybe affecting the reserve studies, maybe making reserves mandatory rather than options to waive them. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here a little bit. And I'm saying the same thing other people have said already. This is not, anything new per se. But again, I'm just raising this to say that, unfortunately, when terrible things happen, then the law pivots or adjusts to that. We saw it, 30 years ago almost with Hurricane Andrew, and the changes in the building codes. After that, that's the first one that comes to my mind. And then second big one comes to my mind was that, the unfortunate pandemic, and now this unfortunate collapse. So, in the same vein, we all learned through the pandemic and adjusted, and we're going to learn through this latest thing and adjust again.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. The next session will probably have a real long list of changes. Hopefully, they'll have have them simple enough and have had consulted with the proper professionals to rewrite the language so that it's understandable and doable. But as well as I that the legislature is, just like Congress, is torn between special interest groups. So what comes out of the effort will be interesting to see.
Right.
But
I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, I don't know what. Again, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what's going to happen. I know there's going to be change. To what degree is still obviously unknown. But you're right. There's going to be a lot of voices involved from different sectors on this. All I'm predicting, like everyone else, again, I'm not unique here. All I'm predicting is change. Now, what degree, I don't know. Will there be? You may have local as well as state. I mean, like for example, the only two counties, as we all know, because we've read all about this now, but I knew it before. The only two counties in Florida that had this building recertification were Miami-Dade and Broward, and it was a 40-year. So, is the state going to have their own certification, or different counties going to have, perhaps more stringent certifications? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
The whole reserve aspect of it, that's going to, I think, end up being probably through the state, and are they going to take away the waiver? I don't know. They might get a lot of pushback from that, from various association interests. So we'll see.
Yeah. Well, the reserve portion of it probably is one of the ones they can more easily deal with, and should, in my opinion. We just finished our annual, or every 3 years, I guess it is, reserve study, and not the interim one our auditor, our accountant does, but the professional one. And we are below 30% of where we should be, and not in a good place. So our board is going to tackle that this year. They voted to adopt the recommendations of the study, and that's good. I was happy about that. But it still means that we're really only funding the projected reserve analysis, and not in the real world what we might need to fund. So I do think, and for the benefit of others that are listening on boards like me, I'm back on now. Retired a couple times, but I'm back on it. Reserves are important, and attention.
Mark's been beating the drum for years. Not that I'm speaking for him, because he's right there, but Mark for years has been beating the drum for mandatory reserves without the waiver. That associations, and Mark is not the most government should stick their nose into business people in the world. But here, Mark, and I don't want to speak for you, but I think he's been saying for a long time that for the best interests of the state and for the people who live in condominium associations, in particular, co-ops, that the reserve should be mandatory, and in many states it is. I mean, Florida's a bit of the outlier here. I haven't done a real study on this, but I think probably more states than not require the reserves without them being waived.
And so my complaint has always been that, first of all, the waiver of reserves is being done without adequate information.
Without thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, and what they do is numbers are presented to the members. The members look at the numbers and they say, okay, we'll fund half of that, thinking they're funding half of the number that's necessary, maybe. And they're looking at some of the stuff and saying, okay, this isn't going to have to be done for another 10 years too. So, so it's still in pretty good shape. I'm good. And then, and then the numbers are not good. They get a reserve study and they're only funding a third. And that thing that they thought was going to last 10 years is only going to last 5 years or 4 years, which means that it's much closer to an issue, to a problem. And so my whole thing has been that I think that whether you still allow the waiver, I think that you have to make it mandatory that they have a reserve study done.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that those two things go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Okay. It doesn't make any sense to be waiving something that's inaccurate or not, and we only had the reserve study in place for 2 years, and even that could be waived. Right. So it was an 08 to 10, 2008 till 2010, where it was, you had to have a reserve study. I believe it was every 5 years. Okay. Mm-hmm. But just like reserves themselves, that study itself could be waived by vote of the membership. So I think what you're going to see probably at a minimum is mandatory reserve or engineering studies, not subject to waiver. I'm not sure what the year is going to be. No one knows obviously yet. So at least your studies are based on numbers that, make sense. Now, all this is still guesstimates, right? I mean, they're still, estimates, but at least they're educated estimates, hopefully.
Well, and the other thing I'd like to see him do, which was the intent originally of the division, was to to make pooled reserves mandatory full funding. To me, waiving or partially funding pooled reserves is ludicrous. I mean, it's just a disaster. And and that's the other thing. So if you want to give people the option of doing that, pooled reserves, which I'm not a big fan because stuff gets buried and it results in underfunding. But if you're going to do that, then make it full funding. At least make it mandatory that you're funding. If you're going to use a pooled method, that you're fully funding on this thing.
Yes,
you know, it's
definitely.
Yeah, I mean, Jim, I mean, I didn't mean to go completely off into a tangent about that. I was just raising it just because it made, sense with respect to how the law evolves, like it did with the emergencies, and now it's going to evolve again. So,
yeah.
Well, I think both of you have stated very accurately what should happen with reserves.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping that's going to be the way it's going to go. But I think we got a caller. Edna, are you still on the line? Edna, are you there?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I was just going to get to you now. Appreciate your patience. And I don't know if Jim's still on hold, but I was going to try to bring you into the conversation so you weren't waiting here. I know you had a question. Go ahead.
Okay. Jim brought up the business about posting of meetings. One of the things that I've noticed is that people aren't posting committee meetings. And from my understanding in 718, the committee meetings have to be posted in the place on the property that's been designated with an agenda. And then after the meeting occurs, then minutes are also supposed to be posted, and I assume to the website. Is this correct?
Well,
Edna, could you turn your radio down just a little bit in the back? I think we're getting a little bit of kickback on that.
Okay.
Thank you. Go ahead, Peter. I'm sorry.
It is correct that, let's take a step backwards. There are two committees of associations, condo associations, that must, because this does not apply to HOAs. They're different. But in a condominium context, your budget committee and any committee authorized to take final action on behalf of the association or on behalf of the board, those committees must always post their meeting notices with an agenda, and the meetings must be open in the same manner as a board meeting. So they have to follow the exact same rules as the board does with respect to the notice of that committee meeting. What the Condominium Act also provides is every other committee, okay, in addition to those two, must also follow the parameters or follow the rules with respect to board meetings in terms of posting, agenda, everything else, unless the bylaws exempt those committees. So unlike boards, the bylaws can exempt basically all the committee meetings from being posted and open. Some bylaws do. The ones that I amend typically have that in there. Many bylaws do not. So that's one thing you have to check and see whether the bylaws do exempt these other committees from having to post notice. Now, again, the two must always post in the budget and anything authorized to take final action on behalf of the association. Typically minutes don't get posted physically on the property, but through the website, fine. They don't usually get posted on the property. They can, but there's no requirement that they be physically posted.
Yeah, that's a good point. And one of the things that I guess I think that I don't know, Edna, if that answered your specific question. Did that address your specific question? I guess. Wait a minute. Is she okay?
She might be listening, but
okay. That's good. I just wanted to. It
was just to make a point that we have to post things.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, good.
Yeah. Well, you do. Yeah. Again, And Edna, this is actually a good point, because this is something that usually kind of gets forgotten, honestly, that committee meetings, again, these other committees, unless the bylaws exempt them from having to post, yeah, they have to post. And it could be any committee, really. It could be the decorating committee, it could be this committee, that committee. Doesn't really make a difference which committee, unless the bylaws exempt them from having to post or notices, then they do, like I said, in the same manner as the board meetings.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, that's and that's a good point, and I think it's something that is going to get more scrutiny.
Okay. The other part of that, let's.
Go ahead, Edna. I think
Let's say that a hospitality committee puts out a contract with a band or something like that. Is that taking final action for the board?
If they've been delegated the authority to basically approve that that contract, or to approve entering into that contract and spending that money, yeah, I mean, that's final action. See, because most committees are advisory in nature and are not authorized to take final action. Advisory meaning that, let's take this committee, for example, whatever the hospitality committee, that they could recommend to the, and I'm assuming that that everything else is dotted I's and crossed T's, that this is a common expense and it's all proper. I'll assume that for sake of argument. That if this committee was simply recommending to the board, look, I think we should hire the Mark Breckbill Jazz Band of Renown, okay, because they're really good, even though Breckbill drinks, no, kidding. They are really good. And I just slandered you, Mark.
That's
radio.
all right. That's all right. It's not slander
anyway,
if it's the truth.
But if they were simply just recommending to use the Mark Breckbill Band of Renown, and the board makes the final decision, then that's not taking final action. Okay. But if they're actually authorized to go out, choose the band, review the contract, sign, yes, theoretically sign the contract, although I'm not sure how they would be able to sign it because they're not board members. But anyway, but if they were authorized to take, quote, final action, unquote, yeah, they would be under that requirement. And then, as I said before, unless the bylaws exempted that hospitality committee, whether it was being advisory or final action, they would still have to post or notice for their meetings, because the bylaws did not exempt them if they were simply advisory.
So you're going to have to take my band, Edna. That's all. That's the way it works. So either that, or you got to post that
If
meeting.
the authorization is done, I assume that would have to be a motion by the board.
The authorization, what, to give them the ability to make a final decision? Is that what you're saying? I mean, when that committee was created,
Yes.
I don't know. Yeah, the board would have had to delegate it to that committee certain
Yes.
duties or powers or whatever. Okay. And definitely, if they're going to be authorized to take, quote, final action, unquote, yeah, that would have had to have been some sort of delegated authority.
Yeah, so that the board would have to have stated that. So, for example, they make a motion that the committee can authorize an expenditure up to a certain amount of money, that kind of thing. So, and then that would be a delegated authority. So, and that would be something then that would require, when that money is being spent. Now, doesn't necessarily mean you need to post every single meeting of every single thing that committee meets on. You would just really have to, I think, would have to post the minutes of the meeting where the contract itself was being discussed, the payment terms, and letting the contract. If up to that point, you have 6 or 7 meetings where you're talking about what kind of an event we should have, what kind of band we should have, what kind of activities, how much it's going to cost, if anything, that kind of thing. All of those kind of things, I don't know that you would necessarily In this particular case, I don't know what's your thought, Peter. My thought is that I was just thinking that they've only got delegated authority for that specific act. Then really, that's the only thing that would require.
Yeah, that's always a super kind of grayish issue, because even for boards, many lawyers get into arguments about when there's what constitutes a board meeting, because it's under the definition, it's any gathering of a quorum or more of directors to conduct association business, whatever that means, right?
Right.
So then it's where do you cross the line into, quote, conducting association business, unquote. So I think you're right to a degree that with this committee, they're under the same guidelines. When are they conducting their own business? So it's hard to say. It really all depends. You kind of just you have to make the best judgment call on what is a meeting that deserves or needs to be posted. I'm always pretty conservative on this, and I think if in doubt, post. Quite frankly, just because it's tough to draw that line.
Yeah. Well, and it's true. It is. It's kind of hard to determine sometimes where you're at on some of that, but yeah, that's speaking of that, and speaking of meetings and board meetings, I think it's probably appropriate, Peter, to kind of talk a little bit or have some discussion relative to what boards should be discussing and shouldn't be discussing right now as it relates to reserves, with all of the things that are going on right now. It's my opinion that the boards need to be cautious relative to making blanket statements that may or may not be true. And
I agree. I mean, 100%, because I know I've gotten questions, because owners are looking and buyers are looking for assurances. Okay.
right.
Everything is great. We're completely safe. We're fully reserved, or whatever. Okay. And you got to think it through. I mean, you can't just make blanket statements that could be misleading or wrong, one way or the other. So I think you do have to think it through before you issue statements that could come back to haunt you at some point, or be misleading, or just flat out wrong. Because even if you're keeping, quote, full reserves, unquote, as you just mentioned before, what you think is full might not be full, right?
Right. Exactly.
So depending on what it's based upon. And again, you don't want to say, this building is fantastic. It'll never happen what happened down there. Well, again, that situation, exceedingly unfortunate. I do still think it's exceedingly rare to have that type of,
right.
Failure. But having said that, we've seen it once. So obviously, if you've seen it once, it is possible. So you just got to think it through. Don't go into any kind of panic mode. I mean, I think you have to be. You're obviously this caught everyone's attention, and you got to be aware and check your out. Have your building checked out depending on the age and and your history of maintenance and that kind of thing. But you really got to talk to your professionals, whether it's the attorneys, the engineers, whatever, and evaluate before you start issuing statements.
Yeah, you do need to be real careful about that, because as we just talked about, the stuff potentially gets in the minutes. Another reason why, when it comes to taking minutes, that you only put the information in there that's required. You don't
Correct.
need to have a lot of language about discussions of this and discussions of that. I had a situation a few years back, and where it was an annual meeting, and the president of the association at the time was acting as chair of the meeting, made the comment in some preliminary remarks that I forget what it was. Something was going to go up, and that there was going to be a need for a special assessment. Well, first of all, that wasn't necessarily true. They didn't have a budget that was proposing a special assessment or anything else. But soon as that information is in the minutes, we've got disclosure issues in the financial statements, because now you've got somebody that says that there's the potential for special assessments, which is definitely um, uh, material information for the reader of the financial statements. So you've got that kind of situation where somebody makes an offhanded remark, and all of a sudden you're in court dealing with it at this point. And let's face it, everybody knows that at least with oceanfront condos, you've got spalling. And the question is how much, how fast, and how long. Those are the things that you gotta know. And we experienced here with the Roosevelt Bridge. That was a spalling problem, and everybody was surprised that it would happen that quickly. And it is largely because of a couple things. One, there was a place where they feel like the rebar on the bridge got exposed to more water, more salt water, and we're off the ocean, but you're still right there near some brackish water, and probably allowed for more deterioration than the original building design or the original bridge design anticipated. So there was no failure on that bridge per se, but there is a significant amount of rebar now that they're having to replace or take care of, and you're going to have that, and it is good to have discussions. But again, I'm going to go back to what I've been saying for a few years now. It would be much better if you're having those discussions with a reserve study in hand that's done by an engineer that's going to tell you what the actual age of your building is and what actually needs to be done. I am a little reluctant, and I know there's other people that are a little afraid that the legislature is going to come in and mandate certain things, and we know how expensive that is, and I understand that there's a kind of a trade-off, but when you're talking about the safety of that many people, I think the board's got some responsibility, and I think many of the boards have taken that responsibility. The problem is not the boards. The problem is the members. They don't want to see that increase or can't afford it. And frankly, right now is the best time to do it if you have to do it. Housing prices are through the roof. So if you've got a significant cost and you don't have the savings for it, interest rates are minutely low, and it's and the values of your units are higher than they've ever been. So if you need to borrow against it to make those repairs, now is about the cheapest time you're ever going to do that. And that's I think that's the thing that I get a little bit irritated about, and is that people need to stop using the "I'll be dead by then" theory of reserve funding. It just doesn't work, and I just it's irritating because you're actually doing a disservice to everybody else, including the people that subsequently buy your unit. You've taken advantage of them by utilizing your unit and getting advantage of these benefits of your maintenance and the way the building looks and all of that, and you're making them pay for it. So it's kind of a it's kind of a thing that it's an equity thing, in my opinion, putting people on kind of fair ground. But we'll see what happens. But I do want to make that point, is that if you're going to discuss the subject at a board meeting, first of all, I don't think it's a good idea to be recording all the discussion, because that's not necessary. Board members are allowed to discuss things without it becoming part of the record. People think that's not the case, but they can. But I think you need to be careful, because if you do start saying things that you don't have facts to back up, and like Peter said, you can say, well, we're fully funding our reserves. Well, if you haven't had a reserve study that's relatively recent, within the last 5 years or so, I don't know you can make that statement, and so that's another factor. The other thing I want to make a point, and it's kind of against accountants, but a lot of the companies that do reserve studies are accounting people primarily. They have a certification, but they're primarily accounting people that are figuring out about what it's going to cost to do something down the road. There are companies out there that are engineering firms or utilize engineers for their reserve studies. They go out and look at the building to determine its actual age and how much time before something is actually going to need to be repaired or replaced. And they also identify, or come pretty close to identify, all of the things that may need to be reserved for. And that's a big deal, because part of the reason that reserves are under funded many times, even if they think they're fully funded, is that there are a number of items out there that no reserve is being provided for because nobody realizes that they're out there. That's everything from multiple pieces of multiple items for repair, like equipment or pool pumps or whatever they might be, or elevator cabs or whatever that should be included in your totals and aren't, because you think it's under a maintenance contract or because you don't repair them all the time or whatever. And so you end up with a lot of these things. Two, on the other side, at the big end, $250,000 or $500,000 underground work that needs to be done to replace roads and storm sewers. And associations find, oh, we're responsible for that. And then boom, bingo. And so there's a lot of those kind of things out there. And as a result, that's one of the reasons that reserves in general, even when they're fully funded, are probably underfunded because of not taking into consideration everything. So again, be prudent, have this done. I'm going to make one other comment about this. One of the reasons the board members are reluctant to do this is they're afraid, well, once I've identified all of this, we have to reserve for it. You do not. You have to identify the items. You have to indicate why you're not reserving for them. For example, if the item's under $10,000, your answer might be, we're handling those in our operating maintenance. So we don't need to reserve for those items. They're being constantly replaced and repaired during our normal operating budget. So that may be a reason that you're not setting up a reserve item for that.
Well, it's probably worth here to Mark just to mention real quickly the things that are supposed to be in the reserve budget or in the reserve schedule. And that's painting, paving, and roof, no matter what they cost. So there is no dollar amount on that. Painting, paving, and roof. And as you mentioned, it's anything else that costs more than $10,000 to repair or replace on a deferred basis. Those are the things required to be part of your reserve schedule.
Right. So, and there's a little bit of juggling around there that, there's some things that have to be looked at. For example, I always use the pool pump example or the pump example. Let's say you have a reserve item for pumps, and maybe that includes your landscape pump, your pool pumps or pump, and some other pump that you might have around. So those in total might be more than $10,000. So if you look at we're going to reserve for pumps, then you would have a reserve item for those items, even though individually they're under 10 grand. But again, if you're saying, okay, they're not, there's a difference between the pool pump and the irrigation pump. And so we're going to handle those on a maintenance basis because they're not tied into the same system and not likely to have to be repaired all the time. So that's the other thing that you need to take into consideration is that when you repair something, and this is supposedly the benefit of pooled reserves, but the reason that they're kind of messed up is that if I'm going to repair, let's say I'm going to do some balcony repairs, right? And I've reserved for balcony repairs, which probably I didn't because I thought it was, too long term. And that's the other thing, Peter, is it's also, you don't technically have to reserve for building structure, right? Isn't it anything, you don't have to reserve for anything that's older, that lasts longer than how many years is it? Isn't there some provision?
That's not in the statute.
Yeah, I guess it's just the way that it's always been talked about. But a lot of times they leave out, and that's one of the things.
They leave out the most expensive thing.
Right. I have never seen it disclosed on the reconstruction of the building. I've seen now balconies, but I have not seen a single association have a line item in their budget for structural repair of the internal rebar. Yeah, and they should. That's obviously something that's going to wear out at some point, and you're not going to replace it on a piecemeal basis. Nobody's going to.
Well, that's why you're going to see some more specifics on that, I think.
Yeah, I think you are too, and so. But what I was getting at is when you do that kind of work, let's say you are going to do the balconies, you're probably going to paint at some point after you're done with that because it's tearing up the outside of the building. So that's the other thing. If you've got if you've got painting 10 years down the road, you've got balcony repair 5 years down the road or 3 years down the road, your reserves aren't going to make it because you're probably going to have to repaint or reseal when you do those balcony repairs. So there's a lot of those kind of things right now that just are making reserves incorrect and are going to result in special assessments. And the last thing I would say, and I don't know if it was a factor down south, but I will tell you this: when you have people that have bought condo units on the ocean 30 or 40 years ago, 25 or 30 years ago, and they came down here to retire on presumably, and in many cases, a fixed income, it's tough for them. So you cannot put them in a position they have to have a special assessment. You have to reserve for this as you go so that they can take it a little at a time out of their budget and not be faced with a situation that they have to sell their unit at 85 because they can't afford to make the assessment. So anyway, well, that's kind of all we got time for this morning. Appreciate the calls from Jim and Edna and all of there. And we appreciate everybody listening. Peter, I appreciate your wisdom. It always is good. And I know our listeners really appreciate it. And I appreciate you being here every Monday morning with us. And I appreciate all of you being out here. We'll be back again next Monday between 9 and 10 o'clock answering your questions about condos, HOAs, and maybe talking a little bit more about what to do. So thanks for joining us right here on WSTU Digital 1450, Martin County's Heritage Station.